In 2008, 3 years after becoming Tory leader, David Cameron deployed this attack line against the then Labour government. He complained that Labour had maxed out Britain's credit card. Now, that claim formed the basis of the 2010 Tory campaign, and then George Osborne's first budget, reported on here by Sky.
Today is the day when Britain steps back from the brink, when we confront the bills from a decade of debt.
The figures for cuts are stark. The language was more measured.
For local government, the deficit we have inherited means an unavoidably challenging settlement. There will be overall savings in fundings to councils of 7.1% a year for 4 years.
The public sector will pay in job losses and, most likely, increased pension contributions.
From the perspective of filling the hole in the public finances, we will seek changes that deliver an additional £1.8 billion of savings per year in the cost of public service pensions by 2014-15, over and above the plans left to us by the last government.
That austerity package from George Osborne caused a social and economic catastrophe that still scars Britain today. But unfortunately, after 14 years of Tory government, the credit card analogy is back, only this time from Labour. Shadow Treasury Minister Darren Jones said this morning.
We have to deal with the books as we inherit them from the Conservatives. And they've spent all the money. They've maxed out the country's credit card. Debt is higher than it has been since the Second World War.
Keir Starmer repeated that line today in Parliament.
The British people know this will not stop. 5 more years and it will only get worse. There will be no change of direction without a change of government. And that leaves Britain a nation in limbo, unable to shake off the Tory chaos that dragged us into recession and loaded the tax burden onto the backs of working people and maxed out the nation's credit card.
Maxed out the nation's credit card. So Keir Starmer sounding a lot like George Osborne and David Cameron back in 2008 and 2010. So, you can see what they're trying to do here. That was an electorally successful strategy for George Osborne and David Cameron. People understood that analogy and they thought that, yes, Labour must have been irresponsible. We understand credit cards and they have maxed out the credit card, right? Electorally successful. But then they followed it with austerity. It was very damaging, right? So if Labour are using this analogy now, what are they going to do in government? Because the logic of the analogy is don't spend any money. From an economics or the perspective of an economist, do we have a national credit card and is it maxed out?
We don't have a national credit card, and therefore I can't answer your second question because it's neither maxed out nor not maxed out because it doesn't exist. And as you rightly are hinting, this kind of analogy it feels almost designed to make economists sort of foam at the mouth, and not just progressive economists. Economists across the kind of spectrum pretty much, I think, understand that these kinds of simplistic stories don't apply to the public finances. It's simply a different kind of financial game when you're doing national accounting, issuing bonds, running a central bank. It's just not the same thing as household finances. It seems very deliberate that Labour are doing this. It's not the first time, even in the last few weeks. Keir Starmer had a clip and a press release a few weeks ago, and the language was in 2 or 3 things simultaneously: a Guardian op-ed, an ITV clip, I think, and a press release. And I actually went and checked to make sure it wasn't a slip of the tongue. So I think they are doing this very deliberately. There's a really interesting sort of switch of places. I actually listened to the PM programme, and there was a Conservative MP saying, the national debt isn't that high. We can actually get away with borrowing more to give away tax cuts to those on higher incomes, despite the fact that, as you say, when debt to GDP was 20 percentage points lower back in the sort of 2010 era, they were saying credit cards maxed out, there's no money left. It was clearly wrong then because we've added a whole bunch of extra debt and nothing particularly bad has happened. And it's wrong again. It's clearly being done with an election in mind. They think, exactly as you said, it's something which resonates with the public. They can use it to damage the Conservatives in the way that Conservatives damaged Labour with it. But it's, again, highly dangerous. I mean, it's highly dangerous, I think, in a similar way to accepting all the Conservative tax cuts. Once you start talking like this, you may then have to kind of follow it up. But my hope is that it's a tactic to get over the line, and then once they get there, they'll start saying something a bit more sensible or doing something more sensible. Ultimately, is what matters. I mean, ultimately, I don't mind if they say it if they actually do something sensible, like raise taxes and spend some more on government services.
There's been somewhat of an interesting trajectory when it comes to this credit card analogy, because I feel like, the Tories used it in 2010. It was their justification for austerity, which didn't go very well. The debt didn't go down, and we ended up with a very unproductive economy, and lots of people suffered unnecessarily, essentially. And I think that meant that people changed maybe the Corbyn leadership as well, but people sort of changed their mind about the necessity of austerity and this credit card analogy working, the household finance analogy working, to the extent that Liz Truss becomes Prime Minister, and she says, look, none of this matters. We don't even need to go to the OBR. I'm going to cut taxes. Our debt is the second lowest in the G7, let's say. So we shouldn't worry too much about it. Then she gets into power. The markets, throw a hissy fit, and within 40 days she's out. And then now all of a sudden it seems like the kind of economics where you say maybe, the OBR totting up these numbers and saying the debt's going to fall over 5 years. The people who said that don't matter now have sort of Liz Truss as sort of this load they have to bear. Oh, you told us that debt doesn't matter. Well, Liz Truss did some unfunded tax cuts and then the economy crashed. So, I mean, Joe, do you find it harder to make that argument, that the household analogy doesn't work for the state? Because Liz Truss kind of made that analogy, and it did seem like her policies did flop, right? So you can see why Labour would be sort of nervous to make the same argument.
There's a lot going on in there, isn't there? I think there's a few things I would point to. It's broadly accepted by economists that across a sort of a reasonable degree of the spectrum that these kinds of analogies are incoherent and shouldn't be used. So let's sort of reiterate that one. There is a less widely held view that goes further and says there really is no limit. A state like ours, which has its own central bank and can print its own money, can just do whatever it likes. There's literally no financial limit. We just pretend there's a financial limit. And that view has sort of traditionally been picked up by some on the left, not many. It's not a view I subscribe to at all. I think it's quite a misleading view in many ways. But it's also filtering into that sort of strand of sort of alt-right Trumpist kind of thinking. And actually, it's not that new, because in the US, the Republicans always just paid absolutely no interest to the public finances, ran up big deficits. And it was always the Democrats, in a way, who tried to be the sort of austere ones and sort of fiscally so-called responsible. So I don't think it's that new. It was interesting that Liz Truss sort of took on that kind of story of, we can just get away with whatever we like. I think there's a couple of things. I think she was a bit unlucky, to be honest, in the sense that there was this technical issue with the pension funds, which was just sort of waiting to blow up and blew up and caused a bunch of trouble. But I do also think that investors in the bond markets, the people who buy government debt, do take a view on what you're doing, what your government is doing. Is it going to borrow some money to rebuild its schools, develop its health service, install clean energy, etc.? Or is it going to give a bunch of money to people who don't need it and will immediately send it offshore or spend it on luxury goods or whatever? So I think that you can continue to make the argument it's wrong, that these household analogies are wrong. That's not to say there's no limit, and we do have to, take into account public finances. But I do think with a sensible sort of broader plan in place, and particularly borrowing for investment, if you borrow for long-run investment, my hunch is the bond markets could swallow a whole bunch more. You could probably get away with another 10, 15, 20 percentage points on GDP, which for comparison is kind of the rise we saw as the result of the pandemic, the furlough scheme. So it's a big, it's a big chunk of extra borrowing, but it's not without limits, and we can't pretend it's completely without limit.